really pleased to introduce Dr. Dimitri Gavriloff. So Dimitri is a senior clinical psychologist and a specialist in sleep medicine at the Oxford University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, and is also clinical course tutor in sleep medicine at the University of Oxford. So Dimitri is going to explore some evidence-based tips and suggestions for us about how we can support children and teenagers. So thanks so much, Dimitri. Oh, I can't hear you at the moment. I think you're going to...
I thought I'd muted myself.
Yeah, perfect.
I knew that was going to happen. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks, Faith, for laying the context of sleep problems. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you guys today. Sleep is just so important, and it's so great to have the space to talk about it in relation to what people are experiencing during COVID. I think that the caveat I want to start with is that you know, if we'll try and cover some basic sort of generalized advice for improving sleep, or the way I like to put it is giving yourself the best opportunity for sleep to happen. But if you're someone who you may have a sleep problem yourself, or you might know or be looking after a child or young person with a sleep problem, if this is a problem that's a genuine concern and is something that's causing significant daytime impairment and impacting their well-being, then going to seek specialist help is really important. And the best place to start with that is going to your GP and looking for, if necessary, a referral to a sleep medicine specialist. But that health and safety sort of caveat out of the way, let's talk about what's going on now. So we know that during COVID, we've heard this hundreds of times. It's not normal. This isn't normal, routine day-to-day life, and most of us are experiencing some significant stress. Whether that's stress as a result of work patterns changing, existential angst about the nature of how society's changing, whether we've got to do things at home that we might not have always had to do, things like homeschooling, and as young people, maybe having significant disruption to your social interactions with peers, your ability to manage schoolwork. All these kinds of things impact our sleep. And sleep is very interesting because as you'll notice, if you've ever spent a sleepless night preparing for a webinar, or preparing for a talk at school or something, you'll know that even a small amount of anxiety, a small amount of frustration at not being able to sleep, can keep you awake for a long period of time. And that's because anxiety is evolutionarily adaptive. It's there to keep us safe. And when we know there's something not quite right, we don't let ourselves go to sleep. Which makes sense when you've got saber-toothed cats and things prowling around. But in the context of existential angst about things, and sort of worry about doing the best you can, it can also keep you awake. So what I'm going to talk about today is general advice, but people may have had sleep problems before COVID, and they may have had sleep problems as a result of COVID, but certainly the stress involved with what's going on at the moment is likely to be making things a little bit worse. And that's understandable, I guess, is the place I want to kind of start from. So I'm going to start with some very basic stuff, and I just want to start with thinking about context. So sleep happens for us as humans at night, nocturnally. So we're optimized for daytime activity and function. At night we sleep, and what that means is that at night it's cooler, it's darker, and it's quieter. And so trying to make sure that you give yourself as much of an opportunity to replicate that in your bedroom, or the bedroom of the young person in question is really important. And there are things that you can do that are very practical and helpful for achieving that. Things like leaving windows open prior to going to sleep to allow the temperature to drop. We say about sort of 16 to 18 degrees, something like that. That sounds quite cold, but a nice warm duvet and blanket to keep you warm is good, but the outside temperature being low is helpful for sleep. We actually shed core body temperature during the night. That's part of the circadian process that Faith talked about earlier. We may actually drop 2 degrees in core body temperature as we sleep, and so allowing the body to do that is important. If you get too much covers on, or if your room's too hot, it'll just wake you up, make you feel uncomfortable. Blocking out noise is also really important, and earplugs are maybe a way of doing that. But other ways that people might find helpful for kind of switching off the racing mind, or just drowning out noise that they have in the background, is using things like white noise. So that could be the sound of rain or recordings of a fan in the background, just to kind of give you a kind of a neutral sound to which to sleep. And some people find that helpful. Certainly, we're going to talk a bit about light as we go through, but light is really important. Light's stimulating for us as humans, and it is something that will inhibit the secretion of this crucial hormone for sleep called melatonin that we secrete every night through the pineal gland. And so light exposure prior to sleep and light exposure whilst we're trying to sleep is unhelpful. It's alerting. So blackout blinds are a good way of doing that. And thinking carefully about the context in which you sleep. So I haven't picked a particular bedroom there. That's just that's one generic messy bedroom. But what we have to be careful of is just making sure that we protect our space for sleep this sounds like quite obvious stuff, but making sure that your bedroom's a nice place to sleep, is a conducive place to sleep, I think is really important. Cluttered with work stuff, textbooks, other bits and pieces, that might be stuff that inhibits your ability to just drop off and to relax. And in line with that, what I also want to talk about is something that we call in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, we call stimulus control. And stimulus control really refers to something that we call the bed-sleep association. So being in bed for good sleepers is associated with being asleep. It's not associated with other stuff. If I say to Faith, grab a tennis racket and some tennis balls, let's head down to the courts, Faith will expect reasonably that we'll be going to play tennis. Now, if we arrive at the tennis courts and I say, right, let's do a meta-analysis of sleep disruption in children, young, whatever it is, then of course Faith will be surprised and think, oh, that's weird, I thought we were coming to play tennis. Now, if we do that every time we go down to the courts, we do something other than play tennis, we might, I don't know, make fresh pasta or write an opera or do something ridiculous, then of course over time, the association between grabbing the rackets and going down to the courts loses its meaning. It ceases to become about playing tennis. And in the same way, doing things in bed that aren't sleeping, i.e. being awake and worrying, using your mobile phone to chat, which is also a very natural thing that young people do quite a lot. When I was younger, we didn't have mobile phones to interfere with our sleep, but playing games, whatever it is, that can all erode this association between being in bed and being asleep. And so one of the things that might be helpful to think about if you do have an issue with your sleep, if you do have problems with your sleep, is trying to re-establish that strong association. And just the way to think about it is, if you're not asleep in bed, good idea to get out of bed and to go somewhere else and do whatever you're going to do somewhere else. And if it's playing games, fine, absolutely fine. Do it in a beanbag in your room or do it outside the bed, but keep the bed just for sleep to improve that bed-sleep association. We talked a bit about the clock already, and I think that the biological clock is crucial here in understanding the nature of sleep problems in teenagers and younger people. We very often see what Faith described earlier. So this is something that in a diagnostic sense is called the delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, but in a kind of more normalistic or normalized sense is just later bedtimes in adolescence. If you have people who are going to bed later and they're sleeping right through until the point at which their clocks are saying, right, it's time to be up now, when they get up, they're getting light exposure. And that light exposure at that time, after they've got up naturally, resets the clock. It keeps the clock, the body clock, ticking on time. And so when we get up every morning, I'm up every morning at around 7 o'clock or 6:30. When my 4-year-old makes sure I'm awake, that light hits the back of my eye and resets my clock. So keeping a regular rise time and allowing light to hit the eye at the right time every day is really crucial. For children and young people with that later disposition, that later sleep-wake phase, getting light too early, which we'll talk about in a bit, can be unhelpful actually for the clock. And making sure that they get it at the right time is crucial. But the key here is maintaining a regular rise time and a regular routine. So during the day, trying to do your best to keep a schedule, be active during the earlier part of the day and less active during the evening. Try and mimic the kind of activity you would be doing when you had a more structured time. And thinking about napping and exercise too is important. So Faith talked about how if we nap during the day, we steal sleep pressure. So we've got a pressure cooker of sleep that builds up sleepiness, that builds up throughout the day. And at the end of the day, we're all exhausted. We get into bed and then the valve is open and the sleepiness dissipates across the night. That's the way sleepiness works. So in terms of napping, if we nap during the day, what we do is we turn on the valve and we let out some of the sleep pressure during the day, which means we don't have enough to get to sleep quickly when we get into bed at night. So napping is not a great idea unless, of course, there's a sleep disorder, which might mean that you, like narcolepsy or hypersomnia, where actually that might be a helpful part of your treatment plan. But in a more normalized sense, actually, we probably want to avoid napping as much as possible and keep sleep for the night. And in terms of exercise and activity, similarly, we want to make sure that we're doing exercise and activity in the way in which we would do this naturally. And we would typically do this when the sun's out nice and bright during the earlier part of the day. And as evening draws in, we would do less physical activity and start winding down. And mimicking that day to day is really important. And it might be that in a teenager, that's just delayed a little bit, remember, because their clock is set a little bit later. So maybe they're doing things a little bit later than younger people and adults. We talked about winding down a little bit, but winding down is really important. The way I like to think about it with people is thinking about braking distance. So when I talk to my patients about slowing down in the evening, think about stopping distance in a car. You can't just slam on the brakes and stop the car. That ends up in a messy situation. So what you do instead is you gradually decelerate and you arrive at a stop. It's similar when we get out of bed in the morning. We don't jump out of bed and then suddenly, get into work mode. And we slowly get ready. We have a bit of breakfast, maybe have a coffee, put on our clothes, or have a shower, put on our clothes, and get off. So that's a gradual increase in activity and a gradual decrease in activity must mimic each other. They're helpful ways to ensure good sleep. And one of the things that people might find helpful in terms of winding down is making sure that they're doing that with plenty of time. So it might be that that's an hour and a half, or maybe an hour, even up to 3 hours perhaps of time, just to kind of just gently slow down. And what we're doing there is also we're listening to the body clock. So we shouldn't really be thinking about when to sleep based on an arbitrary clock on our wrist or a watch. We should be thinking about what the body tells us in terms of when to go to sleep. If our body tells us that it's time for sleep at 10:30 because we're eyes are starting to sag and we're starting thinking, oh gosh, it's droopy eyelids, time for bed, then that's a good sign that it's time for sleep. If, however, we're thinking, do you know what, it's 10 o'clock and I should be asleep now, I'm not really feeling very tired, then that's probably an unhelpful way of doing that. So having your wind down routine fit with your own natural rhythm, something that you will know more about yourself than anyone else will, is important. And there are techniques that might be helpful to add into that wind down routine to maximize it. So things like relaxation exercises, a bit of mindfulness practice maybe in the evening, doing things like putting the day to rest, which is a technique where if you've got stuff the next day that's on your mind, and it could be that in adolescence, lots of these teenagers and young people might have stuff that they're worried about, or stuff that pops into their heads in the evening. Taking a pad and paper and writing all that down a couple of hours before bed, then making an exhaustive list of all the things you've got to remember, all the things you've got to do, and exactly how you're going to do them the next day, planning it out in advance, and then going back through the list again in a kind of an exhaustive and a pedantic way helps to just take some of that mental energy out and put it on the desk ready for the next day, so you don't have to deal with it when you get into bed. The other thing I wanted to talk about is something we call sleep effort. And there's a great German Jewish psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, who was an Auschwitz survivor. And he came up with this wonderful way of describing sleep. He said that sleep is like a dove that sits by your hand. I'm paraphrasing, he did it in a much more poetic manner. Sits by your hand until you look at it, at which point it flies away. And so trying hard to get to sleep is literally the worst way to get to sleep. It's not, we don't have to be operant in this. We're not trying to do it. Sleep will come when we give it the opportunity to come. And so when we allow the dove to come back, it'll come back and sit next to us and we can be happy again. So one of the things we suggest to people is if you're in bed and you're not falling asleep quickly, if you're in bed and you're lying there awake thinking, gosh, I'm just not asleep yet, I'm starting to get really irritated by this, then that's not going to help you get to sleep. So staying in bed and trying harder is not the answer. 15 minutes might be a good rule of thumb, quarter of an hour. If you're in bed for more than a quarter of an hour and not asleep, hop out of bed, find something else to do, enjoyable, quiet, pleasant, something like reading, maybe doing a jigsaw. It can be something relatively banal. It can be something enjoyable. And come back to sleep when you've allowed sleepiness to return, because that frustration, that anxiety, that sleep sort of effort will mask sleepiness. And so sleepiness will look like it's not there, but it is there. It just needs to be allowed to come back, because remember, anxiety stops us, anxiety small a, stops us falling asleep. So this might be something that people recognize. We've heard some interesting data from Kathy on how children and young people are sleeping in the studies. But what I tend to see in clinic quite a lot is young people who, as Faith has already said, into bed at maybe midnight, past midnight, especially teenagers, and then being dragged out of bed by their hair at 6:30 by a frustrated parent who's doing their best, and the young person's doing their best, everyone's doing their best. But our Victorian time schedules aren't they're not amenable to this kind of thing. And so what you see there is truncated sleep across the week. And then there's a catch-up sleep. So kind of a sleep binge, if you like, on the weekend, where the young person's doing their very best to catch up on all the sleep that they need. Their body's keeping them asleep because it needs the sleep. There's a good rate of return on sleep debt. You don't need to pay it all back. You can pay a little bit back, and that's enough. But we don't want to be in debt with our sleep. We want to be allowing sleep to be maximized as much as possible. And then non-school time or holiday time, certainly now, a lot of people may be experiencing this kind of pattern where actually they're sleeping more to their natural rhythm, still going to bed late, but they're actually sleeping in until the clock says, right, time to get up now. And at that point, you see that actually that pattern is quite consistent, and that's what we're trying to aim for. So the reason I put this in here is because what I want to say to people is, if you do notice that that's the case with your sleep as a young person, then that's okay at the moment. That's not your fault. That's your body doing what it does naturally. Putting yourself under undue pressure to maintain a very early rise time during this kind of period might not be the best way of approaching things for now. When we get back to school time again, eventually, whenever that comes about, then we can think about actually moving your sleep back a bit. And the way we'd encourage people to do that is allow people plenty of time to do this. Remember that sleep moves very gradually. You can't move the clock quickly. That's why jet lag happens. So what you do is you move it back slowly. And I'd suggest, this is very generic advice, and this isn't tailored to any particular individual, but try and move it back 15 minutes a day, maybe 10, 15 minutes a day, and allowing the person to wake up naturally, then moving it back a little bit the next day, and lots of bright light in the morning after they've woken naturally, or if you wake them up 15 minutes before they wake naturally, that's ideal. Too much light 2 hours before they wake naturally or thereabouts will actually maintain the delay. It'll make the delay worse. And so that's why you see these people who, in this example, are kind of unable to move their sleep back, not least because their clocks aren't being there's not any kind of input to change the clock, but the light's coming too early. They're getting it 3 hours here before they would naturally wake. So as school times come back again, using bright light in the morning to help bring that back gently from the natural offset over a few weeks, I think is a reasonable thing to do. Here is some recap on some good tips. Emily, we can go through these at the end if you like, or we can go through them now.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think go for it now, Dimitri. That's great. Yeah.
So keeping sleep regular with a regular rise time and a regular routine. By the way, this applies to adults too. So if you're here on behalf of someone else, but you're also interested in it for yourself, then this stuff's good advice too. And we'll send around a bit more blurb on this that people can use and can share to keep the bedroom and the bed dedicated to sleep. Don't let it get confused. Play tennis on the tennis courts. Don't learn to play the oboe. Develop a wind down routine that's conducive to sleep. So relaxation is important. Maybe even reading a nice book, something you enjoy. Stimulating activity, activating activity, like looking through the news or trolling, trawling through social media. That kind of stuff might not be the best. And protect sleep from competing demands. These little things dominate our lives. They are pinging all the time. Here's an email. Someone's trying to get hold of you. I don't know what it's like for an adolescent these days. It wasn't like that when I was an adolescent. It must be quite intense. Keep your sleep separate from that. Allow that to be put away before bed, just to give yourself a nice protected space. It's not about punishing people. It's just about trying to make sure that you're giving yourself the best opportunity for sleep. Keep active during the day to promote good sleep. So activity during the day is a really good predictor, or dynamic daytime activity is a good predictor of good sleep. And keep sleep for the night time. Sleeping during the day is unlikely to help with good sleep at night. In fact, it would probably make it worse. And remember, the body doesn't know the difference between a weekday and a weekend. It just hasn't got the memo. That whole thing is arbitrary. And so keeping sleep the same on weekdays and weekends is really important. Make sure you've got a consistent routine that doesn't change.